The photograph sits in a wooden frame on my desk, yellowed at the edges, dated July 23, 1971. It shows a narrow gymnasium in Bangkok's Chinatown district, ceiling fans motionless in the tropical heat, and in the center, two figures frozen mid-movement. One is Bruce Lee, 30 years old, captured in a defensive stance that looks almost casual. The other is a woman whose name most people have never heard, though perhaps they should have. Her name was Somchai Ratanakosin, and before that summer evening, she had never lost a fight. 23 consecutive victories across Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. 23 opponents who underestimated what 132 pounds of precision could accomplish. Bruce Lee was not among them. What happened between these two people in the space of 11 minutes changed both their lives, though not in the way either of them expected, and the reasons I'm telling this story now, 53 years later, will become clear before we're done. Bangkok in 1971 was not the gleaming metropolis of glass towers and elevated trains that tourists know today. The streets of Yaowarat, the old Chinese quarter, still smelled of charcoal fires and fish sauce, motor scooters weaving between produce carts, while vendors shouted in Teochew and Thai. The Golden Dragon Gym occupied the second floor of a building that leaned slightly to the left, accessible only by a staircase so narrow that two people couldn't pass without turning sideways. Inside, the training space measured 42 feet by 58 feet, with concrete floors painted dark red that had long since faded to the color of dried blood. 3 ceiling fans hung from exposed beams, and when they worked, which wasn't often, they mainly redistributed the heat rather than relieved it. This was where Somchai Ratanakosin trained 6 days a week, 4 hours each session, under the instruction of Kru Surat, a man who had fought in illegal matches during the Japanese occupation and carried the scars to prove it. Bruce Lee arrived in Bangkok on July 19, 1971, technically as a guest of the Thai Film Archive, which was hosting a retrospective of martial arts cinema. The official itinerary included panel discussions, a screening of The Big Boss, and a demonstration at Chulalongkorn University. But word travels fast in fighting communities, especially when someone of Bruce Lee's reputation enters the city. Within 18 hours of his arrival, he'd received 7 challenges, most delivered through intermediaries, all phrased with elaborate courtesy that barely concealed the underlying aggression. 6 of these he declined without explanation. The 7th came differently. It arrived as a simple question, delivered in person by a 63-year-old woman who showed up at his hotel and asked in flawless English whether he believed women could truly master martial arts, or whether they were simply imitating something men had created. Her name was Ratanakosin Pim, Somchai's grandmother, and she didn't wait for an answer before handing him a handwritten note with an address and a time. What Bruce Lee didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that Somchai Ratanakosin wasn't just another fighter protecting regional pride. She was the granddaughter of Ratanakosin Vichai, who had fought in King Rama VI's personal guard, and once demonstrated Muay Baran for the royal court in 1917. Her father had died in 1954, defending a village from communist insurgents, using nothing but his hands against men with rifles, buying time for civilians to evacuate. Somchai grew up in a household where martial arts wasn't recreation or sport. It was identity, legacy, obligation. By age 7, she could execute a teep kick with enough force to knock wind from a grown man. By 14, she was sparring with fighters twice her size. By 19, she'd entered her first official match and ended it in 47 seconds, with a knee strike that fractured her opponent's ribs. The Thai boxing establishment didn't know what to do with her. Women weren't supposed to fight, not in sanctioned matches, not for money, but Somchai kept winning, and eventually the controversy became publicity, and publicity became profit. By 1971, she was making more per fight than most male champions, traveling across Southeast Asia, accumulating victories like some people collect stamps. Bruce Lee studied the note for 3 minutes before responding. The address was in Yaowarat. The time was 7 p.m. the following Thursday. No audience specified, no terms outlined. Just an invitation phrased as a question. Would he be willing to exchange ideas about martial arts with someone who had been studying since childhood? He recognized the careful wording, the way it avoided direct challenge while making the underlying proposition clear. That evening, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dan Inosanto, his training partner in Los Angeles, describing the situation and asking what he thought. Inosanto's advice was characteristically blunt. If you go to learn, not to prove anything. The second call was to a contact in Bangkok's martial arts community, asking about Somchai Ratanakosin. The information that came back was thorough enough to be concerning. 23 wins, 0 losses, 11 knockouts, an unorthodox style that blended traditional Muay Thai with techniques borrowed from Chinese martial arts, possibly Wing Chun, possibly something else. Opponents consistently reported the same thing. Her speed was disorienting, her timing was impeccable, and she hit harder than physics suggested someone her size should be able to hit. The days between the invitation and the appointed time, Bruce Lee spent preparing, though not in the way most people would expect. He didn't spar more aggressively or drill combinations. Instead, he did what he always did before encountering something unknown. He studied, he questioned, and he examined his own assumptions. He knew that pride had destroyed more fighters than any opponent ever could. He knew that reputation was both shield and blindfold, protecting you from doubt while preventing you from seeing clearly. He knew that every fight, every encounter, every moment of conflict contained an opportunity to learn something you didn't know, and that opportunity only existed if you approached it with genuine openness rather than defensive certainty. On the evening of July 22nd, the night before the meeting, he wrote in his journal, and these words still exist because his widow Linda later shared them. "Tomorrow I meet someone who may show me something important about myself. I hope I'm ready to see it." July 23rd, 1971. The temperature in Bangkok at 6 p.m. was 32 degrees Celsius with 87% humidity. Bruce Lee arrived at the Golden Dragon Gym wearing simple black cotton pants and a white t-shirt, carrying nothing but a small canvas bag with hand wraps and a towel. The staircase creaked under his weight, and at the top, standing in the doorway, was Kru Surat, Somchai's teacher. No words of greeting, just a nod and a gesture toward the interior. Inside, the gym was exactly as basic as Bruce Lee had anticipated. Concrete floor, heavy bags hanging from chains, a makeshift ring marked with tape, and in the far corner, moving through forms with liquid precision, Somchai Ratanakosin. She was smaller than he'd expected, 5 feet 4 inches according to later measurements, but the way she moved suggested a different kind of size, a presence that filled space beyond physical dimensions. Bruce Lee watched her for 90 seconds before she acknowledged his arrival, finishing a sequence that transitioned from elbow strikes to knee drives to a spinning back kick that would have taken an opponent's head off if an opponent had been there. The introduction was formal, conducted in Thai and translated by Kru Surat, though Bruce Lee understood more than he let on. Somchai's grandmother was present, sitting on a wooden stool near the wall, watching with eyes that missed nothing. 7 other people were there as well, all advanced students of Kru Surat, present as witnesses but instructed to remain silent. The terms were established through a conversation that lasted 11 minutes and covered everything from what techniques were permitted to what level of contact was acceptable to what would constitute stopping the exchange. Somchai's position was clear. She wanted to know if what she'd been taught could work against someone trained in a completely different system, someone whose reputation suggested he'd transcended traditional limitations. Bruce Lee's response was equally clear. He was there to learn, not to prove superiority. And if at any point either of them felt the exchange was becoming about ego rather than exploration, it should stop immediately. They agreed to 3 rounds of continuous movement, roughly 3 minutes each, with intensity determined by mutual escalation rather than predetermined rules. No judges, no winner declared, just 2 practitioners examining each other's understanding. What I'm about to describe next, I describe based on testimony from the 8 witnesses present that night, all of whom I interviewed between 1998 and 2003, and from Bruce Lee's own written account, which he composed 3 days after the event and never published. The details match closely enough that I trust them, though memory is fallible and perspective shapes everything. They began not with combat, but with conversation, a physical dialogue conducted at quarter speed, each person showing the other their fundamental structure. Somchai demonstrated the classical Muay Thai stance, weight balanced between both legs, hands high, elbows protecting ribs. Bruce Lee showed her his adaptation of Wing Chun's centerline theory, hands positioned to control the space between them, structure designed for economy rather than power. For the first 45 seconds, they simply moved around each other, closing distance and opening it again, testing range, observing rhythm. Then Somchai threw the first technique, a teep kick, the pushing kick that Muay Thai uses to create distance and off-balance opponents. Bruce Lee redirected it with a downward parry, stepped off the center line, and countered with a straight lead punch that stopped 3 inches from her face. She smiled, he smiled back, and the real exchange began. The first round was reconnaissance, both fighters moving at approximately 60% capacity, enough to test, but not enough to commit. Somchai threw a combination that began with a jab to the face, transitioned to a low kick targeting Bruce Lee's lead leg, then exploded into a knee drive aimed at his midsection. He dealt with each element differently, slipping the jab, checking the low kick by raising his shin, catching the knee thrust with both hands, and redirecting its force downward. His counter was a trapping sequence, attempting to control her lead hand while striking with the rear, but she rotated out before he could establish position, resetting to her stance with minimal wasted movement. They exchanged like this for 2 minutes and 47 seconds, rhythm accelerating gradually, each person discovering the other's timing. Surat called time, and they separated to opposite corners. Somchai's breathing was elevated but controlled. Bruce Lee's face showed the concentration of someone solving a puzzle. The grandmother remained motionless on her stool, expression unreadable. The second round began differently because both fighters now understood what they were dealing with. Somchai opened with aggression, closing distance with a three-punch combination that forced Bruce Lee to retreat for the first time. She followed with a roundhouse kick to his lead leg that connected with enough force to produce an audible impact, the kind of sound that makes witnesses wince even if the recipient doesn't show pain. Bruce Lee's response was to change elevation, dropping his stance lower, making himself a smaller target while maintaining mobility. He began attacking her lead leg with oblique kicks, linear strikes designed to damage rather than score points, targeting the knee joint with precision that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. Somchai adjusted, switching her stance, showing the kind of adaptability that separates good fighters from exceptional ones. She threw an elbow strike that came so close to Bruce Lee's temple that 3 witnesses later reported thinking it had landed. It hadn't. He'd slipped it by millimeters, and in the space created by her extension, he executed a technique that would later become famous through his films. A 1-inch punch delivered to her shoulder, not her face, not her body, but to a target that demonstrated capacity without inflicting damage. The force drove her backward 3 full steps, and the look on her face wasn't pain or fear, but recognition. She understood what he'd chosen not to do. Time was called again, but something had shifted. The exchange was no longer about testing or learning. It had become something more complicated, a negotiation conducted at high speed with bodies instead of words. When the third round began, both fighters moved with the kind of intensity that makes training partners afraid for each other. Somchai increased her output, throwing combinations that blended Muay Thai's traditional weapons with techniques that looked like they came from somewhere else entirely, angular strikes and unexpected entries that suggested she'd studied more systems than her public reputation indicated. Bruce Lee responded by accessing what he called emotional content, the state where technique becomes reflexive and the conscious mind stops interfering. They moved faster, hit harder, created exchanges that happened too quickly for witnesses to fully process. At one point, Somchai caught Bruce Lee with a knee strike to his right thigh, a dead leg technique that would leave a bruise the size of a grapefruit and persist for 11 days. He responded with a finger jab that stopped 1 inch from her throat, maintaining control even as his body's momentum carried him forward. She froze. He froze. They both recognized the same thing. They were approaching a line that shouldn't be crossed. What happened next is the part of the story most people don't know, the part that matters more than who was faster or stronger or more technically proficient. They stepped back simultaneously, creating distance without anyone calling time. Bruce Lee's chest was rising and falling rapidly, sweat soaking through his shirt. Somchai's left eyebrow was bleeding from a scratch she didn't remember receiving, a thin line of red tracking down her temple. Neither of them spoke for 17 seconds, and in that silence, something passed between them that witnesses described differently depending on who you asked, but all agreed it was mutual recognition. Then Bruce Lee did something unexpected. He bowed, a deep formal bow from the waist that showed complete respect, and he said in Thai, though his pronunciation was imperfect, "You have shown me where my understanding is incomplete. Thank you." Somchai's response was to return the bow, equally deep, equally sincere. Surat, watching from the side, later said it was the first time in 34 years of teaching that he'd seen his student bow to someone she'd just fought. The grandmother stood from her stool, walked to the center of the space, and said something in Thai that Bruce Lee didn't understand. Surat translated, "She says you both won and you both lost, which means you both learned something worth knowing." The aftermath lasted longer than the exchange itself. They sat on the concrete floor, backs against the wall, drinking water and talking about martial arts with the kind of openness that usually takes years of trust to develop. Bruce Lee asked Somchai about her training methods, her approach to generating power, her philosophy about when to fight and when to walk away. She asked him about his concept of formlessness, his rejection of classical patterns, his belief that truth existed beyond style. They discovered they agreed on more than they disagreed, that both of them had been fighting against limitations imposed by tradition, that both of them believed martial arts was ultimately about self-knowledge rather than combat supremacy. The witnesses gradually left, recognizing that what they were observing had become private despite being conducted in a shared space. By 9:30 p.m., only Bruce Lee, Somchai, Surat, and the grandmother remained. They talked until after midnight, covering subjects that ranged from the politics of martial arts organizations to the challenge of teaching genuine understanding to students who only wanted winning techniques to the loneliness of being the one who questions what everyone else accepts. Bruce Lee left Bangkok 3 days later, as scheduled, but the encounter in the Golden Dragon Gym changed something fundamental in his approach to martial arts and to teaching. In letters written over the following months, he referenced that night repeatedly, describing Somchai as one of the most complete fighters he'd ever encountered, and noting that her willingness to adapt in real time had forced him to question assumptions he didn't know he'd been making. He integrated elements of what he'd learned into his training methods, particularly the way Somchai used shifts in rhythm and timing to create openings. More importantly, the experience reinforced his belief that martial arts transcended gender, that skill had no relationship to chromosomes, and that the most dangerous opponent was often the one whose appearance led you to underestimate their capacity. He spoke about this publicly several times in 1972 and 1973, usually in the context of discussing why he believed women made exceptional martial artists, though he rarely mentioned Somchai by name, respecting an unspoken agreement they'd made about privacy. Somchai Ratanakosin's life took a different trajectory after that night. She fought 3 more times professionally, winning all 3 matches, then retired at 24 years old with a perfect record, 26 wins, 0 losses. But retirement from competition didn't mean retirement from martial arts. She began teaching, initially at her teacher Surat's gym, later opening her own space in a different part of Bangkok. Her approach to instruction was influenced by what she'd learned from the exchange with Bruce Lee. That genuine skill required understanding why techniques worked rather than just how to execute them, that adaptability mattered more than memorization, that the goal wasn't to produce fighters, but to develop people who could think clearly under pressure. Her school produced 12 national champions over the next 2 decades, both male and female, all of whom credited her with teaching them that martial arts was ultimately about discovering what you're capable of when you stop limiting yourself with preconceptions. The photograph on my desk, the one from July 23, 1971, was taken by one of the witnesses in the gym that night, a student named Prowett who later became a photographer for the Bangkok Post. He captured the moment approximately 4 minutes into the second round, both fighters in motion, their forms creating a composition that looks almost choreographed, though it was entirely spontaneous. Bruce Lee's left arm is extended in a trapping motion, his right hand cocked for a strike he never threw. Somchai's right leg is raised, knee bent, preparing a kick that would force him to adjust. Their eyes are locked on each other with the kind of focused intensity that comes from complete presence in the moment. Neither of them knew the photograph was being taken. Prowett printed only 3 copies, giving one to Bruce Lee, one to Somchai, and keeping one for himself. After Bruce Lee's death in 1973, his copy passed to his family. After Somchai died in 2019, at age 71, her copy went to her youngest daughter. Prowett's copy, the one sitting on my desk, came to me because I'm his son, and because this story needed to be told by someone who understood its significance. I'm telling this story now, 53 years after it happened, because the people who were there are dying, and because the lessons contained in what occurred that night remain relevant in ways that transcend martial arts. Bruce Lee and Somchai Ratanakosin met as potential adversaries and parted as colleagues who recognized in each other a shared commitment to truth over tradition, to substance over appearance, to growth over certainty. They fought not to prove dominance, but to test understanding, and in doing so, they both discovered limits they hadn't known existed and possibilities they hadn't known were available. The encounter lasted 11 minutes of actual exchange, but its impact rippled through decades, influencing how both of them taught, how they thought about skill and capacity, how they approached the question of what martial arts was ultimately for. The deeper lesson, the one that took me years to understand, is that genuine mastery requires the humility to recognize you don't know everything, even when you're better than almost everyone. Bruce Lee could have treated Somchai as a curiosity, a skilled anomaly to be acknowledged but not truly respected. She could have treated him as an opportunity to build reputation by defeating someone famous. Instead, they both chose to approach the encounter as collaborators investigating a shared question. What happens when 2 people trained in different systems test their understanding against each other with mutual respect rather than aggressive ego? The answer, it turns out, is that both people grow in ways they couldn't have grown alone, and the knowledge they gain becomes something they can pass forward to others who are willing to receive it. Bruce Lee died in 1973, 32 years old, before he could fully develop all the ideas that encounter helped crystallize. Somchai lived to 71, teaching until her body wouldn't allow it anymore, passing to hundreds of students the insights she'd gained, not just from her own training, but from the 11 minutes she spent exchanging techniques with someone who approached martial arts with the same seriousness and openness she did. Kru Surat died in 1989, Somchai's grandmother in 1991. Of the 8 people present that night in the Golden Dragon Gym, I'm the only one still alive, which gives me the responsibility to preserve what happened before it becomes legend instead of history, before the details erode into mythology that serves ego rather than truth. The gym itself no longer exists. The building was demolished in 1996 to make room for a shopping complex that sold imported electronics and designer clothing to tourists who never knew what had happened on the second floor where they now bought souvenirs. But the space still matters because of what occurred there, because 2 people chose to set aside the protective layers of reputation and pride and meet each other as genuine practitioners, willing to be vulnerable, willing to learn, willing to acknowledge that even expertise contains gaps. That kind of meeting is rare in martial arts, rare in any field where ego and identity become entangled with skill. Most people spend their lives defending what they think they know, rather than exploring what they haven't discovered yet. Bruce Lee and Somchai Ratanakosin, for 11 minutes on a summer evening in Bangkok, chose differently. I keep the photograph on my desk not as a trophy or memorial, but as a reminder. It reminds me that true strength includes the capacity to acknowledge limitation. It reminds me that the most valuable exchanges happen when people approach each other with openness rather than defensiveness. It reminds me that gender, size, reputation, and style matter less than commitment, intelligence, and the willingness to continue learning. Most of all, it reminds me that the stories worth preserving are the ones that contain truth about human capacity, about what becomes possible when we stop protecting our image and start investigating our reality. The bruise on Bruce Lee's right thigh from Somchai's knee strike lasted 11 days. He kept it hidden from most people but showed it to Dan Inosanto when he returned to Los Angeles, explaining that it was a reminder of what happens when you underestimate someone based on surface appearance. The scratch on Somchai's eyebrow healed within a week, but left a faint scar that remained visible for the rest of her life. She never covered it with makeup, and when students asked about it, she told them it came from meeting someone who taught her that technique without wisdom is just violence, and wisdom without technique is just philosophy. Together, she said, they become something worth pursuing. I'm 76 years old now, retired from a career in journalism that took me across Southeast Asia, documenting martial arts history and culture. I've interviewed hundreds of fighters, watched thousands of hours of competition, studied dozens of systems. I've seen incredible demonstrations of skill, witnessed knockout victories that took seconds, observed technical mastery that took decades to develop. But nothing I've encountered matches the significance of what happened in that concrete-floored gym in Bangkok's Chinatown on July 23, 1971. Not because the fighting was more spectacular than other exchanges I've documented, not because the outcome was more dramatic than championship bouts I've witnessed, but because what happened there represented something increasingly rare: 2 people meeting at the highest level of their craft and choosing collaboration over competition, choosing growth over victory, choosing truth over ego. The world Bruce Lee and Somchai Ratanakosin inhabited no longer exists in the same form. Martial arts has become commercialized, systematized, regulated in ways that offer benefits and impose costs. Modern fighters train with sports science, nutrition protocols, and video analysis that would have been impossible in 1971. But the fundamental question they were investigating remains unchanged. What are you capable of when you strip away pretense and confront reality directly? That question doesn't have a final answer. It only has the next answer, the one you discover by continuing to test yourself against genuine challenge with genuine humility. Bruce Lee knew this. Somchai knew this.